By 2 p.m. on day 1, the vast majority of the Irving pocket had effectively been mopped up by a combination of armor and mechanized infantry forces, as 5 different battalions had assaulted this pocket, and by 3 p.m. had fully cleared the remaining armed reactionary civilian threats contained therein, as the major fighting again had wrapped up by 2 p.m. By late afternoon and into the evening, another flare-up had occurred by I-635, in which case 2 companies departing from the Love Field, now to become a new forward operating base, from the 16th Infantry Division's Armored Battalion of one of their 2 brigades, had sent a tank and armored infantry company to effectively handle and mop up this particular threat, as armed civilian clusters, even late on day 1, had effectively emerged on the outer periphery of the entire Metroplex, handled by a combat engineer battalion, effectively rolling through the area and ensuring the security of Plano due to the positioning of the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion and the absolutely vital ground-based electronic warfare regiment of the Ready Reserve 59th PLA Group Army, as the 40th Combat Engineer Brigade, apart from engaging in massive combat throughout the entire east of the Metroplex, would also assist the paramilitary National Construction and Production Corps battalions, both the 405th and 58th, with the complete and total fortifications of the new forward operating bases, which included the Meacham International Airport, the DFW International Airport, the biggest forward operating base of all, and a massive key objective taken immediately, including the Naval Air Station, which would be bulldozed and rebuilt with modular portable buildings and other structures, with also Love Field being fortified as well, with even the Taylor Army Heliport also built up into forward operations bases, as the vast majority of the logistical assets of the PLA's Ready Reserve 59th Group Army were still upon all of the initial CCP regime properties whereupon these units had begun initially. The ability to rapidly move in all of these logistical capabilities to the new forward operating bases would be a tall order, although it would be achieved relatively fast. However, for the time being, combat operations had not completely resolved in this particular key node, as by 11 p.m., the external invasion components were now deep within the South Central Invasion sector, having had advanced north from Mexico, including the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 7 through 13, as I-35 was, if not the most critical of the invasion routes in the South Central Invasion sector, it was definitely close, as I-10 and I-35 were both absolutely critical invasion routes to strike into the southeastern United States from I-10 and into the heart of it with I-35, as secondary routes would be utilized further west, and even I-25 in New Mexico in the South Central Invasion sector. The I-35 corridor was perhaps the single most important of the invasion routes, again, or up there with the most important, as it bisected through the middle of the entire nation and led right into its heart, as this critical node had been secured by the Trojan shock armies by this time. As midnight would approach, the externals would be passing through the area, which would take them approximately several hours, as many would stop at the set up CCP regime property logistical sites that would be handled by the 59th Support Brigade, with others continuing north, coming up the I-35E route, as this would relieve congestion of the rapidly moving external invasion forces, to stop in Gainesville, where I-35E and W met up in the north, and there were other further supply points there handled by paramilitary forces of the Chinese. Within this particular invasion sector, in this key node, now that the PLA forces were relatively well spread out An intensive planning phase was now underway, and considerations had to be taken in terms of moving logistics, in terms of effectively the 19th Artillery Brigade effectively signing off on shells being transferred to the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's Artillery Battalion, as they would play a massive role in the assault on the national grasslands, as they had been deemed the perfect asset to utilize for artillery support of a single air assault battalion, which would come from the 83rd Air Assault Brigade among its two battalions, now holding down the DFW International Airport, which had been captured immediately at the opening of the entire invasion, with a combined armored and air assault strike into this facility, which had rapidly seized absolute and total control of it, with heavy air power from the PLAAF supporting this operation, as well as also intensive tactical, ballistic, and cruise missile strikes on certain targets as well. As the DFW International Airport, upon having had been seized rapidly at the opening of the invasion, was now under the control of 3 different battalions, including the SHORAD battalion, having had moved in from the 35th Armored Brigade by this point in time to assist in securing this humongous facility that was to become the chief forward operating base for the PLA forces in this area upon the cessation of the battle and the victory in the war. It was decided that one of the 2 air assault battalions that had initially taken the DFW International Airport could indeed be spared for this operation, as they had in effect had plenty of time to rest in terms of their troops and conduct badly needed maintenance on their helos, both of their combat aviation company and their transport aviation company within the air assault forces on the DFW International Airport turned forward operations base, as it was only in the initial phases of having fortifications constructed in order to effectively ensure security of the facility. The one of 2 air assault battalions with massive PLAAF support would be in fact chosen to conduct a huge attack into the heart of the national grasslands, as it would indeed be a huge attack, not so much in terms of the numbers of forces involved, but in the sheer volume of firepower that would be involved. Even special operations troops, such as sniper spotter teams, would be utilized in this endeavor to effectively eliminate all resistance within the national grasslands, as these forces would be effectively brought in last, including a single squad from one of the operator companies within the entire operator battalion, as intelligence had been gathered that there had been a first lieutenant that had earlier escaped the mass carnage at the Naval Air Station and had fled with a number of armed reactionary civilians into the national grasslands, and had in effect been making attempts to try to organize them into some sort of partisan uprising, as the quadcopter assets of nearby units, including the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's headquarters and support battalion, as well as the artillery battalion of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, and their SHORAD battalion, having been running circuits throughout their areas of operations, including the Northern Firing Grouping of 3 artillery battalions, one PLL-01, one PLL-66, and the PH LO3 battalions, having had also been running circuits around their areas of operation, and the headquarters and support battalion of the entire 19th Artillery Brigade as well in this particular area, in this zone, as they also, of course, had their high altitude and satellite recon assets, making this ISR grid the most formidable in the entire world. The iron grip on this particular entire battle space, which was 60 miles in total length east to west and 30 miles in total breadth north to south. This entire area was on total ISR lockdown, and every action could be seen that was above ground. In terms of the first lieutenant having had made it into this area, captured prisoners of war had effectively been caught in this area of total now PLA control and interrogated, and it had been discovered that there was indeed a first lieutenant, one again that had escaped from the 1st of the 124th Cavalry Battalion, or Squadron rather in Cav terms, to the National Grasslands and was trying to organize these personnel into a formidable partisan fighting force or insurgent force. And thus, in the planning phase, it would be decided to bring in a standard squad of operators along with the sniper spotter teams of the special forces to assist in this operation, as the air assault forces were already quasi-elite troops. The addition of a small number of operators from the 59th Special Operations Battalion would make a great contribution, as another thing had to be taken into consideration within this entire scope and scale of this operation as a whole in the Metroplex was that the entire city needed to be patrolled and held down by the now spread out PLA combat forces, as the artillery battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigade would maintain their azimuths of fire, or their sectors of fire, in order to support any type of maneuver elements that ended up being engaged by partisan forces coming up out of the ground or out of the rubble to challenge them, as this area, again, still needed to be held down, as literal millions of people had gone underground to escape the carnage above, as again, this was a metropolitan area of just over 8 million people. Hundreds of thousands had perished already on day one, and hundreds of thousands of more would also on day two, as the refugee streams throughout the area above ground and small-scale skirmishes that would erupt, which would not equal the size of the battle in the National Grasslands. However, there would be challengers to the occupation forces, which would effectively result in massive artillery strikes into the Metroplex, continuing and destroying new areas that hadn't been hit before, or hitting areas that had already been hit and were now used as rubbled fighting positions for the emerging threats of the armed reactionary civilians vis-a-vis the occupation forces, as the invaders were now occupiers throughout this key node within the fourth generation warfare doctrines, as all key nodes, which were major and medium and even some cases small cities along key invasion routes that held critical objectives that needed to be captured, as controlling all the nodes would ensure that the external invasion components coming in from across the borders, who were the heavy-handed reinforcements of the Trojans, who were already deep inland doing all the heavy lifting, so to speak, could pass seamlessly and easily through these nodes without having to stop, exit their convoy formations off the highways, which would take immense amounts of time, and engage enemy forces to continue on, as this was an old style of warfare, and the new style of warfare had the Trojans seizing the nodes so that the reinforcements, which were the externals who crossed borders, could move rapidly and deep inland and fan out to support the Trojans that were farther inland, as this key node of the DFW Metroplex was now very nearly completely under total PLA control. The planning phase was underway by the highest command echelon of the 59th Ready Reserve PLA Group Army, as the commanding elements were now planning how to go about the eradication of the last remaining sizable grouping of armed resistance that was in the immediate area within this battle space, within this area of operations as a whole for the 59th PLA Group Army. And they opted to use their attached forces of the 83rd Active Duty Air Assault Brigade to conduct this operation, as although these two battalions from the brigade that had initially assaulted the DFW International Airport, having had taken control of it along with the armored battalions from the 35th Armored Brigade of the 59th Group Army, the two battalions had had plenty of time to effectively rest and regroup and conduct badly needed maintenance activities on their equipment, which included their combat aviation company's attack helo gunships, the Z-10s, as well as the Z-20 utility helicopters, which belong to the Transport Aviation Company in each air assault battalion, as the Z-10s would play an enormous role in the upcoming operation in suppressing enemy forces with their very powerful and capable weaponry. The ground forces from the battalion, which effectively included one company of 82 millimeter mortars, as the mortar company was the ground-based fire support assets of the air assault battalion in each battalion, and 4 air assault infantry companies, as these forces would play a massive role in the fighting on the ground, as they would sweep through the areas heavily supported by the PLAAF air power, even some loitering munitions fired from nearby units that belonged to the 59th PLA Group Army, as again, these air assault forces were attached to them. The 24th Light Infantry Brigade and 19th Artillery Brigade would utilize their combat drone sections to support the operations, as well as, in addition to all of this, the PLAAF, utilizing their 5 total bombers that were allocated to this area, as in their heavy strategic bomber aircraft, such as their very powerful H-6Ks and the even more powerful H-20 stealth heavy strategic bombers, would carpet munition entire areas of the national grasslands, being utilized in a tactical support role for the troops on the ground, as well as also the JH-7 strike aircraft of the entire JH-7 squadron, as the J-10 and J-11 fighter squadrons would also participate, as they, by day 2, were now nearly all equipped with solely air-to-ground munitions, minus each having a pair of PL-12s for defensive reasons, as this was standard operating procedure, even though the USAF, U.S. Marine Corps Aviation, and Naval Aviation were all completely and thoroughly annihilated earlier on the first day. This was, again, standard operating procedure, as the aircraft were required to carry a pair of air-to-air missiles for self-defense. As the ground-based artillery forces that would support the operation, which belonged to the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, which were the highly mobile and very powerful at 155 millimeter truck-based artillery howitzer systems, would receive a transfer of 50,000 shells from the 19th Artillery Brigade, who initially begun the conflict with a total of 1 million shells, and by the end of day 1, having had expended several 100,000 of them, still had an ample number of shells. And again, 50,000 would be transferred to the artillery battalion of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade in order to support the massive operation that was to unfold in the national grasslands, as they would have immense support in terms of this operation pertaining to the air assault brigade from the air assault battalion from the 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the PLA's 83rd Group Army, again attached to the 59th Ready Reserve Group Army for the express purposes of the operations in the DFW metro area. And now, as all of these different aircraft loaded down with air-to-ground munitions would enormously pummel targets below. The rotating mid-air refueler aircraft that lingered in the North Texas and southern Oklahoma area were remaining on station into the second day for continued operations, as again, the fighting occurring within the Metroplex was not quite fully over, as the battle for the DFW area would only completely end on day 2. However, there would be a huge lull in the fighting as preparations were being made for this final assault, as again, the troops needed to rest and regroup and recover from all of their earlier combat and conduct very thorough maintenance procedures on their equipment in order to prepare for the next major push. And as by this point in time, although the DFW International Airport was to be the most prominent and largest forward operating base in the area for the occupation forces, not all of the logistical capabilities had been yet moved into this location as of yet, as the vast majority of the 83rd Air Assault Brigade's supplies still remained on their initial CCP regime property, upon which they had departed to seize control of the DFW International Airport. And thus, for this operation, the forces would have to effectively load up and be shuttled back to the CCP regime property upon which they begun, and then, after everything was in proper order in terms of logistical capabilities, then could conduct their assault into the heart of the national grasslands. This particular area of the national grasslands being effectively an 8-mile east-west by 6-mile north-south area. It was a sizable area for armed reactionary civilians to effectively hide within, as they had immense areas of camping areas with large clumps of trees in different areas, while in other areas it was exactly as the name implies, it was grasslands, but this area was relatively hilly and had still immense tree cover in some areas, and thus would require a very methodical sweeping of this area. It would go from a direct major assault and morph into a search and destroy operation for the surviving personnel, as to cordon an area this sizable would require far more forces when it would be just simply more efficient to drop the air assault troops exactly in the middle of the national grasslands and deploy them from there to conduct their methodical sweeps. Again, it would be a very heavy assault, and even would involve, besides just the artillery elements of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, the artillery forces of the active duty 77th Group Army, who had conducted operations both in the Wichita Falls area and the Lawton Fort Sill area, which were relatively close together, as the Group Army effectively split in half to effectively take both installations, as the Wichita Falls area contained the air base and the Lawton area contained the Army base, as the forces of the 77th had already now consolidated their gains at the Shepherd Air Force Base and the Fort Sill Army Base. They could now effectively assist in the operation, as the artillery battalion of their PHL 16s, or also known as the A300 systems, were the longest ranged artillery system in the world, and their capabilities included being able to fire not just their very long-range 300mm rockets, but also their 370mm rockets, which were enormously more destructive, even as horribly devastating as the 300mm were. They could also fire the BRE-8 750mm tactical ballistic missiles, which were a short-range artillery-based tactical ballistic missile system, and these carried quite a payload, but they could only be fired 2 at a time from each system, as the trucks that carried the artillery systems on them effectively could be switched out between the 300 millimeter, 370 millimeter, and the 750 millimeter BRE-8 or Fire Dragon tactical ballistic missiles. And there would be a battery that would effectively out of the battalion that would fire in support of the operations occurring in the national grasslands, just as they did to support the operations against the Naval Air Station. As the forces effectively gathered for the operation, as one of the two air assault battalions that had initially captured the DFW International Airport would remain, along with the SHORAD battalion that had already since moved in on day one of the 35th Armor Brigade to assist in consolidating and holding down and securing this enormously vital objective that was taken. The forces now effectively in full control of the area still had to maintain security over it, and hence the 19th Artillery Brigade's forces would still maintain their fields of fire, covering different sectors of the city to support all the spread out maneuver elements that were now conducting patrols throughout the area to ensure that they remained in control of this vital node. As again, by midnight, the external invasion forces would be passing through the area, both up I-35E and I-35W, and stopping for supplies either in Burleson or in Gainesville, just to the north, which effectively were the forces that split and moved up I-35E. As Hillsborough in the south was where the highway split into two portions, it regrouped in Gainesville. And by 3 a.m., the last of the group armies will have passed through this area as a 3-hour opportunity to resupply would be taken by these group armies to refuel and rearm with any possibly expended ammunition that they might have fired on their miles-long drive-by going through the countryside, as again the nodes had to be secured so that they didn't have to get off the highways in these major and medium cities and get effectively stuck for some time engaging enemy forces, as that was left to the Trojans to make the advance far more smooth and efficient for the external invasion forces to get them deep inland fast, where they could then fan out and assist the Trojans further inland as their heavy-handed reinforcements, as there would also be group armies that were shed off in Oklahoma to assist in that endeavor before fanning out further in Kansas with the remaining group armies, and they would link up with others coming down from Canada. As now the planning had effectively concluded between the end of day one and early into day two, as the command echelons had effectively determined what type of operation should be launched and effectively received vital advice from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which would effectively guide the operation all the way through, along with the command elements of these forces, as this again would involve the air assault battalion chosen for this operation, as well as also the special operations forces, albeit in small numbers, as only one squad from one company from the entire battalion would be chosen to conduct a capture mission to effectively take alive the first lieutenant that had escaped and was now trying to organize the armed reactionary civilians into some type of effective fighting force, as, again, intelligence had been effectively obtained on this from the capture of armed reactionary civilians in the vicinity of the national grasslands who had effectively known about the goings-on in that area. And again, this effectively, during the planning phase, green-lighted the use of special operations forces to capture this lieutenant, or this first lieutenant, because if he was organizing a partisan force, then he too had vital intelligence on the goings-on in this area. As again, intelligence needed to be obtained at all times, which would assist the occupation forces in control of their new colonial settlements, as they needed to know at all times what was going on and where as it pertained to the conquered American peoples. And this included finding out where any viable threats were as it concerned the armed reactionary or just regular armed civilian partisans who were trying to get themselves together and organize themselves into a viable fighting force. As again, the battle would end late on day 2, but effectively the operation would only crush the thousands of armed reactionary civilians that had fled into the national grasslands, who were no longer reactionary at this point in time, but now were actually trying to get organized into a viable fighting force, as well as also thousands of refugees who had fled into the area with them, which would actually seal their fate in many ways, although again the PLA was not trying to effectively annihilate the non-combatant populations. If they were in the way, they were considered collateral damage and would thus be annihilated as such. And now, by 4 p.m. in the afternoon, as the air assault troops, who had already since departed the DFW International Airport, which they had assisted in capturing with the 3 armor battalions from the 35th Armor Brigade, were now preparing to leave on shuttle operations their original CCP regime property, whereupon they had effectively kicked off the entire invasion to capture the DFW airport to begin with. And as they had departed their CCP regime property, as in one of the 2 battalions that had taken the DFW International, they were now beginning to shuttle their forces to landing zones that had been pre-designated by the ISR capabilities, utilizing the real-time AI battlefield data processing system to process that data to effectively put together the perfect landing zones to initiate the operation. As the very first Air Assault Infantry Company, which would be backed up by the Combat Aviation Company in order to secure the LZ, were now being flown in by 4 p.m. in the afternoon on day 2 of the invasion. By now, again, the externals had already long since passed through this vital node, and because the national grasslands were not at all in the way of the external invasion prongs, they could be dealt with later, and they would be, as a fully stocked and fully rearmed, re-equipped, and with heavy maintenance conducted on their equipment, Air Assault Battalion was now moving in to initiate the assault, as many groupings of these armed reactionary civilians had been already seen with their tents trying to camp out in wooded areas as movement in and out had been spotted. BRE-8 tactical ballistic missile strikes from the 750mm artillery-based tactical short-range ballistic missiles would hit and destroy targets in these wooded areas, along with 2 J-11 fighters dropping a pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions each as they flew in and hit their targets as the BRE-8s were hitting initially first. These then flew in, dropped their 1,000-pounders to ensure that everything was thoroughly annihilated at this campsite. As there were roads that traversed through the national grasslands, there was a parking lot with a restroom facility on this hilly terrain here, as this indicates hilly terrain, these brown circles. This is a tributary, or creeks, that run through the area, and again, another one right here. And the LZ had been chosen in this particular spot in the heart of the national grasslands. As we go to the larger map, effectively, this was the area where the landing zone had been chosen, in which point the attack helo gunships would fan out from the Combat Aviation Company to ensure that any armed reactionary civilian elements near the LZs would be properly eliminated as they fired their 25mm autocannons, nose cannons, effectively at these forces with armor-piercing HE ammunition, as well as firing salvos of 70mm rockets from their rocket pods in the case of these two gunships, as well as also their AKD-21 ATGMs at these forces as well, and even this grouping on this hilltop, as all of this was ISR directed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. These forces in these vehicles, which were now off-road from the roadway, were driving through the area. These were effectively souped-up trucks and SUVs, and initially they were already being hit by 25mm fire from these attack helo gunships, and the rest of these four would be finished off by the time they got around on this hilltop here. They would be destroyed by the 25mm fires, as these four attack helo gunships, these Z-10s from one of two flying platoons of the company, were now moving in and were firing their AKD-21 ATGMs at targets, as well as also their 25mm cannon, and also their 70mm rocket pods at targets. They would annihilate a campsite in this wooded area. There were 135 armed reactionary civilians at this time milling about in this wooded area. There were 4 large tents that had been set up. Again, these forces were being annihilated by rocket fire, as indicated by the flame over this whole wooded area, which indicates rocket strikes. These AKD-21 ATGMs would hit this area too, as well as 25mm cannon fire, and also there would be other ATGMs fired at these armed reactionary civilians moving through this area by this gunship, as this gunship here would also fire 2 more AKD-21s at this grouping coming down from this hill, this small grouping of approximately 10 personnel. They would be destroyed by these ATGMs. As other ATGMs would also be fired at this massive grouping fleeing from this area in different prongs. They would also be carpet munitioned by thousands of pounds from a entering H-6K heavy strategic bomber now over the area. And also there would be yet another one conducting a carpet munitioning over this particular campsite, along with massive artillery strikes coming in from the artillery battalion of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, firing 155mm strikes with HE shells and DPICM ammunition into this area. There were repeated shell strikes of these two types, and it would continue for some time to ensure the absolute and total devastation of these forces, as the H-6K heavy strategic bombers dropped their many thousands of 1,000-pound munitions. They would absolutely annihilate these forces fleeing into this area and trying to effectively escape the incoming onslaught from the attack helo gunships, as this area was a 1 mile wide by 1 mile north-south area. These forces were absolutely being pounded, as the spread of these munitions was exceedingly wide, as these aircraft were flying 48,000 feet in the air and had completely and totally smashed these forces fleeing in these directions, as this H-6K alone in this area had dropped 20,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, all 1,000-pounders, as these were literal thousands of pounds of munitions. They smashed these forces to pieces, except for those that had made it to this tributary and had crossed, but then would be pounded as they went through this thin wooded area with 155mm shell strikes, again coming in from the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's firing battalion, and it's comprising batteries picking different targets throughout the national grasslands, all ISR directed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing network, as the thousands of pounds dropped by this H-6K involved another 10,000 over this area. 190 armed reactionary civilian personnel would be flattened in the combination of HE shells, DPICM rounds, which also hit this grouping trying to run into this area, as it was total pandemonium and chaos, and everybody was running for cover in different directions, including in this direction, getting hit by multiple shell strikes, DPICM and HE, as well as here with the thousands of pounds of air-to-ground munitions from the H-6K heavy strategic bombers, which got a massive spread and wiped out a massive area along with the incoming artillery. The tactical ballistic missile strikes from the artillery-based systems of the 77th Group Army's Artillery PHL-16 or A300 Battalion were now coming in and pounding this area at the initial opening, along with the precision airstrikes from the two J-11 fighters dropping their pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided munitions each, along with the tactical ballistic missile strikes from the artillery-based tactical ballistic missiles. The H-6K strategic air raid used in a tactical manner to annihilate enemy troops on the ground, and the heavy artillery strikes. As the PLAAF assets earmarked for this entire battle space were also covering other areas, the aircraft would all be available to conduct some strikes into the national grasslands while continuing to maintain additional munitions aboard for other possible close air support actions over this battle space due to the maneuver elements that were conducting now patrols to ensure their iron grip over the Metroplex. As again, this, while it was a massive action and would involve enormous quantities of air-to-ground munitions, as well as also the attack helo gunship-based munitions, as well as also the sheer might of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's firing battalion, their PCL 181 battalion of 155mm truck-based systems. All of this firepower would be immensely destructive, as even the fighter aircraft like the J-10 Squadron and the J-11 Squadron would participate in this operation, and of course the JH-7 Squadron, with each aircraft carrying a massively punishing load of nearly 20,000 square pounds, as the mortar company within the Air Assault Battalion would be the last to be shuttled in. They too would contribute enormous firepower, utilizing their 82mm mortars to strike targets throughout the battle space, as the Transport Aviation Company was now bringing in their first company of air assault infantry troops to be dropped off into this area. They now had total control over their LZs, their landing zones. They now dropped off their platoons, as there were 15 total helos of the Z-20 variety, the transport or utility helos, and they now, with full control over the area, could disembark their troops. They could now be fully landed, and by platoon could now spread out through this area, as the initial operation was simply an operation to capture and consolidate control over this LZ. In the process of so doing, they also eliminated a very large number of armed reactionary civilians that were encamped in the area or moving through the area and were seen by the ISR assets and effectively were marked for destruction. There were also, again, thousands of non-combatants who were hiding amid the armed combatant populations, as 280 in this area were wiped out by the BRE-8 tactical ballistic missiles, the precision munitions, and of course all the 25mm fire into the area after these vehicles had been destroyed by it, as they were still well within range. This area would see the fanning out of the 3 platoons of the 1st Air Assault Infantry Company to begin their push to the northeast to destroy the remainder of the armed reactionary civilian elements in that area, as other companies now would be shuttled into this freshly cleared LZ, and they would push to the south and west, as the majority of the armed reactionary civilians were in this area, and in this area they would effectively use their 4 air assault infantry companies accordingly to cleanse this area, and then they would conduct search and destroy operations throughout the rest of the national grasslands to get any survivors, as the ISR assets had the area on lockdown they could utilize artillery strikes on anyone trying to flee the area, or they could use loitering munition strikes or even combat drone strikes from Wing Loong 2s, as well as also even dispatching small groupings of other forces that were still in the area to effectively hunt down and eradicate any survivors that had fled, although this would not be an issue as the air assault forces would effectively do a brilliant job of mopping up this area and doing it in a vastly thorough manner, as they had the raw might of the PLAAF supporting them in this, as well as their own very capable firepower within their own battalion, as these troops were quasi-elite troops as it stood, and they would also be joined by special operations forces in a very small number, but for a vital capture operation to glean more intelligence on the goings-on in this entire Metroplex battle space, as anyone deemed any type of leader of partisan elements would need to be either taken alive, hopefully for the PLA, or eradicated, but the PLA preferred them alive because they could glean massive amounts of intel from these interrogations and utilize it to their best advantage in order to decide on troop deployments in specific areas and also what types of firepower should be deployed to different areas that they had available. And now, as the ongoing operation was in full swing, there would be, again, the entire battalion shuttled in to the National Grasslands to conduct their operations. And again, these would be very thorough operations indeed, as mortar strikes would come in to support their own air assault infantry troops. They, of course, had access to ATGMs like HJO-8s, rocket-propelled grenades like so, one being fired at these forces in the distance, an anti-personnel rocket. They had their light machine guns, rifles, 35mm tube-fired grenades, one being fired from a soldier in the prone back behind these troops, fired at this wood line, and also more. The mortar support would be very accurate and on point, as again, it was all ISR directed, and the pre-prepared strike packages put together for the mortar forces to drop mortars on defending forces' positions in this area, as the air assault forces were the by far best choice to conduct this operation, as they were a highly efficient force and the most rapid of all the PLA forces in the area, as they could literally cause immense amounts of surprise by being dropped right in the middle of any enemy force and then fanning out to eradicate them, as again, this was deemed even more efficient than diverting troops from other maneuver forces to cordon and sweep the area, when one battalion of these quasi-elite air assault troops could do the same thing effectively, as in the same thing in terms of eradicating the defending forces in the National Grasslands. And they would do an exceedingly capable job at conducting the operations. As the next video installation in this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through a Sino-Russian coalition invasion will continue to convey the ongoing operations in the National Grasslands, as more and more air assault infantry troops were now being shuttled in at an exceedingly rapid pace, as they did not have to effectively come a very far distance in order to be deployed into this area, as again, they were only in effect moving from their CCP regime property directly into the National Grasslands, which at the most was effectively a 4-minute flight or less, as these helos were not only very close to their objective, but they were very fast and were able to achieve a high degree of surprise against any type of enemy force by effectively getting into the middle of an enemy force, eradicating many of them, and dropping off their air assault troops to mop up, which effectively was what was going on in this operation. as the armed reactionary civilians at this point had not been fully organized or mobilized into any type of real effective fighting force just yet. They were in the process of trying to get organized and trying to effectively set up their campsites, which effectively were doomed from the start because all of these forces had been seen going into the national grasslands at the first day of the invasion. However, they were not the priority at the time. The priority was obtaining control of the metro area, the urban built-up areas, for the easy passage of the external invasion forces, as this could be left for later. And it was, as Day 2 now saw this massive operation, as by the end of Day 1, when the externals had moved through, the entire node, as in the metro area, especially around the major invasion routes, were fully and thoroughly cleared and under complete and total PLA control. And now, late on Day 2, the final act, so to speak, of this particular battle was the national grasslands. As again, a major partisan operation would occur many days after the PLA victory in the DFW metro area, as it pertained to just this area in the country, as underground there would be efforts to effectively organize their own partisan groups, as different groups would arise, led by different people with different qualifications. Some groups would be more effective than others by far, while others would get themselves outright annihilated in rapid fashion. The additional civilians that had fled even further out of this primary invasion zone also had some breathing room, as if they made it to tertiary areas, as in far outlying areas away from any large cities or highway or transportation grids or networks. They had some breathing space to effectively get themselves organized, as even as massive as these coalition forces were, and them effectively taking control of the entire country through all of its transit networks and major cities and medium cities, and major key military installations and other objectives, they still had to clear the tertiary areas at some point, and they would fan out from their primary and secondary areas. The secondary areas were the areas just beyond their initial starting points, where their CCP regime properties effectively were located. They would, upon having fully started to build up their forward operation bases, prepare for further missions outside of the zone. But even so, they would still have problems inside the city itself, as partisan groups would begin to arise to challenge the occupation. And again, the learning curve for the Americans would be excessively painful and a very stark learning curve, and many, many American lives would be lost. Although over the course of time, they would get better and better with their equipment, their tactics, and procedures. It would take them time, as, again, they would be off to a very rough start. And again, some groups would be even more effective than others, and some more so, by a large gulf, so to speak. But for the time being, in the national grasslands, major combat was already now underway, and the American forces, taken by total surprise by the PLA shock troops of the air assault battalion attacking this area, were in complete disarray and were now fleeing in any and all directions, trying to escape from the carnage of missile strikes, airstrikes, attack helo gunship fire, and now the emerging ground troops being landed on their LZs, as each platoon of this first company of air assault troops were now being landed by their Z-20 utility helos, as the attack helo gunships had provided support to help capture and control the LZ. And again, the last company of ground-based forces of the battalion that would be landed would be their mortar company. And they, too, again, would provide heavy fire support in addition to the attack helo gunships for their air assault infantry troops, sweeping the entire area clean of any and all defending forces. Next will be the fighting that occurred to the northeast of this landing zone area. More to come in the next video installation.